Good morning, afternoon, evening. Just had a question come in from one of the trainees on my training program around how do I reconcile racial injustice, systemic racism, colonization within a tantric framework, particularly in a non-dual framework. So from a non-dual perspective, there is no right or wrong, good or bad. There is only what is happening, right? However, this is like an absolute view, and it's really important to understand that within tantric teachings is the absolute view, and then there's the relative view. And so from an absolute perspective, right, which is the perspective of consciousness, of simply being consciousness, from consciousness' perspective, whatever's arising is just the play of life, and there's a delight in whatever's arising. And because from the perspective of consciousness there is no fear of death, there is no fear of pain, there is no fear of anything, then it's what's happening. However, that's not necessarily a useful teaching or a relevant teaching for people that are immersed or mired in or experiencing suffering because of racial injustice, systemic racism, or colonization. And it's really important to acknowledge that as well. These things are real, they are happening, they are painful, they cause suffering, and they cause death. So the way that I reconcile, and I can only speak to myself for myself here, I'll speak for myself. Like, I'm very aware of, and always have been, of the nature of the world in which I was born. I'm aware of my privilege as a white woman, a white middle-class woman. I'm aware that my experience in this reality is very different from that of people of color. And I'm aware that that's inherently unfair, like it's fucked up, right? And it is what's happening. It's the way that it is. So the question then is, from my perspective, is how do I meet this? What's my role in this? How do I support the well-being of all beings? And on a personal level, that means that I educate myself, that I'm informed, that I acknowledge what's unfolding, and that when things intersect with me, when things cross my path, I take action. Or action happens through me as such. I call things out. I speak to things in my imperfect way, right? I'm trying to think of how to give you concrete examples. When I'm invited now to speak on summits or forums or conferences, I'll often look through the people that have already signed up as such, and I will look to see I look at diversity, inclusivity, representation. And if I get a sense, I look and go, wait a second, there's people, I can see there's groups here that are not being included. I will speak to the organizers and ask them about it in an invitational, open, curious way, right? And that's a big part of how I operate as well, is recognizing that judging or confronting, blaming, accusing, attacking doesn't always generate the best results, which is not to say it doesn't also have its place. And that's important to recognize as well, that the tactics or the strategies that we use in the face of racial injustice, systemic racism, colonization, decolonization, they differ depending on who is using it and for whom and when, okay? Just going back to that original question, how do I reconcile these things within the teachings? For me, the teachings are about the liberation, the well-being of all beings. And from that perspective, then it includes the way that I respond to racial injustice. It includes the way I respond to decolonization or colonization. It includes educating myself, informing myself, taking action. I see that as an important part of being on the so-called spiritual path, it's important to engage within the relative, even whilst understanding the absolute. And that's the difference there. It's very easy to use the absolute teachings as a way to deflect or absolve one of responsibility. Oh, it's just the way that it, there's no good, there's no bad, it's just what's unfolding. It's like, yes, and how do we meet that? How do we meet that with compassion? How do we meet that with fierce compassion? How do we turn around and shine the spotlight on those who deserve support, who deserve to be seen, who deserve to be heard, that may not be because of those systemic barriers? I do my own work too internally in terms of recognizing how white supremacy, which I see as a virus, it's a deep level of conditioning that believes that white people are superior to all other people. Right? And even whilst on the surface I may believe that I am not a racist, I do not presume that that virus hasn't infected me in the unconscious way. And so I am open to feedback from people, and I inquire into myself when I notice if stuff does arise, and I do my work around it. That's another way that I deal with this, is that I see racism as another deep, deep level of conditioning. And on the spiritual path, if the spiritual path is about liberation from conditioning, then surely it is about liberation from racism. And from that perspective, if it is about liberation from racism, then surely showing up and doing the work around that in the relative world is very, very important for spiritual people. And to ignore that could possibly be spiritual bypassing. And just keep looking outside at the trees outside, the wind, and just feeling it all. Feeling into what needs to be said on this, because it does feel like a very important topic. I recognize that I cannot change other people. I can change myself. I can become more aware and attend to what's in me. And I can be open to and aware of opportunities to step up, to stand up, to lift up, to support, to do whatever is necessary, to recognize that ultimately we are all consciousness in a human form. And some of those human forms have been more privileged than others historically. Some of those human forms have more power than others, and this is the truth of it. And to acknowledge that truth without fear. Right? And when there is attachment to the power that being white-skinned or being physically abled or being a man or being straight, if there's attachment to that power, then there can be fear of losing that power, because the power is perceived as coming through the physical form. When in reality, real power is formless. It comes from our knowing ourselves as consciousness, and it can never be taken away from us because it is not given to us because of our external form. And so acknowledging the truth of our society, that feels really important to me. And if spirituality is ultimately, for me, it's been about truth and love, right? And about acknowledging fear, facing into fear, and not allowing fear to bind me, not allowing fear to imprison me. So if I notice that I feel fear because there is someone who looks different to me, I recognize that as my fear and I own it, and I do not project it onto them, because that is what racism ultimately is in so many ways. It is fear of the other. It is fear of the power of the other. It is fear of losing one's own power that has been given to one because of, again, white privilege, etc., etc. Maybe that's enough. Maybe that's enough for you to understand how I work with this, how I see this. And whilst, Tantra is not, there is no ethics in Tantra. There is no morals per se. It is focused on awakening to our true nature, that is consciousness. It is focused on liberation from conditioning and enjoyment of life. And yet within that, within the absolute, there is the relative. It's the world that we live in. And how can we liberate ourselves if we don't liberate ourselves from racism? right? And if we are liberating ourselves, then surely we are liberating others as well. We all are called in different ways. We all have different roles to play. And recognizing our own role, recognizing our own responsibilities and showing up for that is what's important. And also, it's probably the final piece to say, is that those who are still exhibiting racist tendencies, who are still infected by the virus of white supremacy, I still see them as consciousness, and I hold them too, and I love them, while not condoning, it's a wrong word, condemning. Condemning, is that the right word? Standing up against their behavior. And I think that's a big difference, right? Is recognizing that you can't be afraid of other people when you're no longer separate from them. When you believe yourself to be a separate individual, then that's where the fear arises from. And so those people that are racist, that are clinging to power, that are defending their right to have slaves. There was only it wasn't even that long ago in the States that people were literally defending their right to enslave others, to enslave other people. Can I love them as well? While standing against them, standing up, you see. And that's where the non-duality comes in. That's where the recognition of the play that's arising comes in, the recognition that everyone is playing their roles, and so being in it, playing the role, but still knowing oneself as a consciousness that holds it all. I don't know if I'm expressing that very well. It's nebulous, it's challenging. That's how I see it though. That's how I see it, to feel genuine love and compassion for all beings, regardless of where they are on this, whilst doing what is necessary to support the liberation and well-being, the well-being of all beings. To recognize that ultimately each of us is powerful, and to recognize that the physical form in which we have incarnated has granted us external power depending on the color of our skin. To acknowledge that. And to remedy that. Alrighty, big love to you all. And thank you so much to Willow for asking this beautiful question that kind of wasn't a question, it was an exploration, but thank you.